High-stakes US-Russia talks on ending the war in Ukraine have failed to yield a breakthrough. While Russian President Vladimir Putin met Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and US President Donald Trump's son-in-law Jared Kushner in the Kremlin. And after earlier signaling his forces were ready to achieve Russia's initial war goals. After the meeting, Kremlin aide Yuri Ushakov said that peace is not closer in Ukraine. Well, Ushakov said that the initial US plan was broken down into 4 parts, which were discussed during the 5-hour meeting. He noted that the sides failed to reach a compromise on one of the most difficult issues, which is territorial disputes.
So far, a compromise hasn't been found. Some of the American proposals seem more or less acceptable, but they need to be discussed. Some of the wording that was proposed to us doesn't suit us. So, the work will continue.
Kushner and Witkoff were to present Putin with a new version of the US plan, which has been hammered out after the initial version raised fears in Kiev and elsewhere in Europe that it made too many concessions to Moscow. Well, Putin had demanded that Kiev surrender territory, which Moscow claims as its own. On Tuesday, Putin claimed that the eastern Ukrainian railway hub of Kupiansk had been under Moscow's troops' control for weeks now. But speaking to journalists shortly before a meeting with Witkoff, Putin said that in a few days, Russia would also capture Kupiansk, Vuzlovy, another Ukrainian settlement south of Kupiansk along the Oskil River.
I think there are 2,000 buildings there. There's fighting going on there. 600 buildings, somewhere around 1,000 already. 650 are in the hands of the Russian army. We are advancing. I think we'll take that settlement too in a few days. That's another settlement.
Russian Defense Ministry has released a video. It shows troops and explosions in Zeleny High, which is a settlement that news agencies citing the ministry say has been captured. Now, as Russia continues to make advances, Putin accused Ukraine's European allies of sabotaging US-led efforts to end the war that has gained momentum in the recent weeks. The Russian leader accused Europe of amending peace proposals with demands that are absolutely unacceptable to Russia, thus blocking the entire peace process, only to blame Russia for it. He also warned that if Europe wants war, then Russia is ready.
We're not going to have a war with Europe, I've already said. But if Europe suddenly wants to wage a war with us and starts it, we are ready right away. There can be no doubt about that.
Now, a Ukrainian delegation could meet Witkoff and Kushner on Wednesday after their meeting with Putin in Moscow. A senior Kiev official told AFP that Ukraine does not rule the meeting out and is ready to meet them, adding that the talks could be held in Brussels, but there is no clear agreement on it yet. Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky said there is no simple solution to war. He repeated his country's insistence that Kiev takes part in peace discussions and that clear security guarantees be agreed, such as NATO membership, a move that has long been opposed by Russia. Meanwhile, Trump said that the war in Ukraine was a mess and not an easy solution and not an easy situation to resolve in this final cabinet meeting of 2025.
We're trying to get that settled. I've settled 8 wars. This would be the 9th, and our people are over in Russia right now to see if we can get it settled. Not an easy situation, let me tell you. What a mess. It's a war that never would have happened if I were president. Not even a chance. And it didn't happen for 4 years.
And for more on this, we're being joined by Peter Kuznick. He's a professor of history and director of the Nuclear Studies Institute at American University. Thank you so much, Professor Kuznick, for joining us on the broadcast.
Glad to be with you.
Now, Professor Kuznick, given the 5-hour talks between Vladimir Putin and the US delegation ended with no agreement and Moscow reiterated the rejection of Ukraine and EU-backed changes, now, was a breakthrough even realistic to start with?
Well, people were hopeful that more progress would be made. But the Europeans and Ukrainians were fearful that the US would just give in to Russia's demands. So the fact that they didn't come up with any final agreement today is probably a good sign. It means that the negotiating is going on and that perhaps we can reach an agreement in the near future. There are two possibilities. One is that we do reach an agreement, and the other is that it's settled on the battlefield. Right now, the cards are in Russia's hands. Ukraine is losing ground daily on the battlefield. It looks now that they've pretty much lost Pokrovsk, which has been a contentious issue for months now. And on top of that, Zelensky's position at home is weakening. We look at who were involved in the negotiations in Florida and in Europe recently. Many of them are tainted by this corruption scandal. Zelensky has lost some of his closest advisors, closest allies to corruption, have been forced to resign. Some have left the country. So his popularity, his approval is dropping by the day, on top of the fact that they're doing poorly on the battlefield, that morale is weakening both on the battlefield and in the streets. And so it's a very weak position that Zelensky is in right now. Putin's strategy is that if he can't get what he wants through negotiations, then he's going to win it on the battlefield, and he's going to take the rest of the Donbass militarily. It doesn't make sense for Ukraine to keep fighting at this point. Ukraine has almost zero prospect of taking back the land that they've lost or of ultimately prevailing over Russia. So what I fear is that the fighting will continue. Ukraine will lose more territory, more lives, more of the economy, more of the infrastructure, and just be in a weaker position 3 months from now, 6 months from now, a year from now, when this final thing is settled. And they're going to end it with this kind of diplomacy. But I think it'll be worse for Ukraine the longer this goes on.
Right, and Professor Kusnik, based on what you've just said, and speaking of good signs, we know that after every meeting, it's been told that the meetings were constructive, it was positive, or some such synonym to describe that, but very little is changing on the ground. The situation remains where it was. And to add to that, earlier on Tuesday, Putin said that changes which were proposed by Kiev and Europe to the US-backed draft peace plan, they were unacceptable, adding that now if Europe wants to go to war and start one, they are ready for it right now. Now, in the light of these developments, what is the possible path forward from here?
I don't like to see these kinds of threats being made. I mean, the Europeans are really playing a very small role in all of this. Europe's position has been diminished. Europe's stature has been diminished. And they're on the outside trying to influence things, but they're not a major player at this point. What they have been doing is keeping the war going. They've been providing arms, they're providing funding, and in some sense, they are in part responsible for what's going on. This is a war that should never have started, but nobody took Russia's demands seriously from 2014, 2018, 2022. There were so many times when this could have been ended diplomatically, and the Europeans and often the Americans urged the Ukrainians not to negotiate, to keep on fighting, and that they were going to back them with as much arms and money as they needed. And it's going to be it's a tragedy. The whole thing is a tragedy. If we've learned anything, we've learned that we have to resolve these disputes diplomatically and not on the battlefield. And that same lesson applies to the Straits of Taiwan. It applies to the South China Sea. It applies to the Himalayas. It applies to Kashmir. It applies to all the crises that we're facing. Gaza is another good example. And especially in the nuclear age, we can't resort to war as a way to resolve disputes. We've got to figure out how to do this diplomatically. And in that sense, I think of Ukraine as a tragedy. All the lives have been lost on both sides, all the treasure that's been wasted on both sides. It's just a very sad thing for the planet
Right.
to see what's happening.
Of course, Professor Kuznick, very valid points there, but of course we'll have to wait and see how the situation develops. But for now, thank you so much for joining us on the broadcast and sharing your valuable perspective with us.
Thank you for having me.